In the mist-shrouded lands between, where ancient sorrows echo through crumbling stone, and the weight of forgotten kingdoms presses down like winter fog, few names carry the resonance of Godwyn the Golden. Here was a prince who should have been the salvation of his realm, a golden-haired heir who befriended dragons and commanded the very lightning itself. Yet his story is not one of triumph, but of tragedy so profound that it shattered the foundations of reality and plunged an entire world into chaos. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let me guide you through the deepest mysteries of Elden Ring's lore. We'll uncover the truth about a demigod whose death changed everything, whose corrupted form now spreads beneath the roots of the Erd Tree like a cancer of undeath, and whose legacy haunts every corner of the lands between. This is the story of Godwyn, the Golden, the Prince of Gold, who became the Prince of Death. Before we begin our journey into the heart of this tragedy, take a moment to settle in. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the day's concerns fade away. The story we're about to explore is one of golden ages and their endings, of friendships that transcended ancient enmities, and of a death that refused to be complete. It's a tale that spans from the highest peaks of divine glory to the deepest corrupted roots beneath the world itself. Godwyn's story is central to understanding the Shattering, the apocalyptic war that tore the lands between apart. But more than that, it's a deeply human story about what we lose when wisdom and compassion are sacrificed to ambition and ideology. It asks uncomfortable questions about fate, justice, and whether some sacrifices are truly necessary for change to occur. As we explore his tale, you'll hear about dragons and lightning, about golden knights and black-clad assassins, about a mother's grief and a brother's desperate prayers. You'll learn how a single night of betrayal unraveled centuries of careful statecraft, and how one prince's incomplete death gave birth to an entirely new category of existence, those who live in death. So let yourself relax, let the weight of your own day settle away, and join me as we venture into the golden age of the Erd Tree, when Queen Marika's empire stretched across the known world, and a young prince with hair like spun sunlight represented hope itself. To understand the magnitude of Godwyn's fall, we must first appreciate the heights from which he tumbled. Born during the age of the Erd Tree to Queen Marika the Eternal and her first consort, Godfrey the First Elden Lord, Godwyn entered the world as the crown jewel of the golden lineage. His birth was an event of cosmic significance, heralding what many believed would be the beginning of an eternal golden age under divine rule. The circumstances of Godwyn's birth cannot be overstated in their significance. Unlike his brothers, Morgott and Mog, twin sons also born to Marika and Godfrey, who were cursed to be born as omens with gnarled horns sprouting from their flesh, Godwyn emerged into the world unmarked by any curse or corruption. In a family where divine blood carried with it the burden of cosmic afflictions, this was nothing short of miraculous. Consider the pattern of curses that plagued the demigod children of Marika. Melania would be consumed by the scarlet rot from the moment of her birth, her body perpetually fighting a losing battle against divine corruption. Miquella would be trapped in eternal youth, his body frozen in childhood despite his vast and growing wisdom. The Omen twins, Morgott and Mog, would be shunned and imprisoned beneath the capital, considered too hideous and cursed to be acknowledged publicly despite their royal blood. But Godwyn was different. His golden hair caught the light like spun sunbeams. His bearing was noble and commanding from the earliest age. His very presence seemed to embody the ideals of the Golden Order itself. He was called Godwyn the Golden, and he became known as the Prince of Gold, a scion of the so-called golden lineage, from which even Godric the Grafted, that pathetic and desperate demigod, claimed distant descent. Yet Godwyn's significance extended far beyond mere bloodline or the absence of visible curses. He represented hope itself, the promise that the divine union between God and mortal could produce something truly sublime. Where other demigods served as reminders of the costs and complications of divine power, Godwyn seemed to prove that perfection was possible, that the Golden Order's vision of an ideal world could be achieved. The young prince grew up in the royal capital of Leyndell during the golden age of the Erd Tree, when Queen Marika's empire stretched across the known world and the light of the great tree illuminated every corner of the realm. These were days of unprecedented prosperity and expansion, when the Golden Order seemed unshakable and eternal. The walls of Leyndell had never been breached. The Elden Ring remained whole and perfect. Death itself had been sealed away, granting a form of immortality to all who lived under the Erdtree's light. In this age of glory, Godwyn received an education befitting his station. He trained in arms with the greatest knights of the realm, learning the arts of war from veterans who had fought in Godfrey's campaigns of conquest. He studied strategy and leadership, preparing for the day when he might be called upon to lead armies or govern territories. But he also learned diplomacy, philosophy, and the complex theological principles that undergirded the Golden Order. From his mother Marika, Godwyn inherited not just divine power but also a keen understanding of statecraft. Marika had risen from mysterious origins to become a god, had shattered the power of the fire giants and the dragons of old, had established an order that promised to last forever. She understood better than anyone how power was won and maintained, and she ensured her favored son learned these lessons well. From his father Godfrey, the first Elden Lord and mightiest warrior of the age, Godwyn learned courage, honor, and the warrior's code. Godfrey was no mere brutal conqueror. He was a leader who inspired absolute loyalty in his followers, who could tame his own savage nature through strength of will. These qualities, passed from father to son, would shape Godwyn into the kind of leader who could win battles not just through force, but through the sheer magnetism of his character. As Godwyn grew from childhood into young adulthood, his reputation began to spread throughout the lands between. Stories were told of his prowess in training, of his wisdom in resolving disputes, of his kindness, even to those of lower station. He was the Golden Prince in more than just name. He seemed to embody light itself, a living promise that the Golden Order's ideals of perfection and eternal glory were more than mere propaganda. But the true test of Godwyn's character would come not through courtly accomplishments or ceremonial duties. It would come through fire and lightning, through a war that would pit the new order against powers that had ruled the world when it was young. The stage was being set for Godwyn's greatest triumph, and the seeds of his ultimate tragedy were already being sown. The first great test of Godwyn's character came not through court intrigue or political maneuvering, but through an apocalyptic assault on the very heart of Marika's empire. Early in Queen Marika's divine reign, the Erdtree came under assault by the ancient dragons who had ruled the world in ages past. This was no mere territorial dispute between competing powers. It was a clash between the old ways and the new, between the primordial forces that had shaped the world since time immemorial, and the divine authority that sought to remake it in a new image. The ancient dragons were beings of incomprehensible age and power. Their bodies were formed of gravelstone, living rock imbued with primordial gold, that same golden power that predated even the Erdtree itself. They had existed when the world was young, when the Crucible held all life in chaotic unity. They had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, had seen the dance of stars and the movement of continents. To them, Marika's Golden Order was an upstart philosophy, a momentary aberration in the eternal cycles of power that governed existence. When the ancient dragons decided to assert their ancient claim to dominion over the lands between, they did not send envoys or make diplomatic overtures. They came in fire and lightning, their massive forms blotting out the sun, their roars shaking the foundations of mountains, and they struck at the heart of Marika's power, the royal capital of Leyndell itself. The breach of Leyndell's walls marked the only time in recorded history that these supposedly impregnable defenses had fallen. Imagine the scene: a colossal dragon, its body composed of living stone infused with golden power, crashing through fortifications that had been built to last forever. The massive form of Granzax, the mightiest of the ancient dragons, to assault the capital, piercing the city's walls in a display of raw primordial might. The sight must have been apocalyptic. Citizens who had lived their entire lives in the security of knowing that Leyndell was invincible suddenly watched as a creature from the world's ancient history tore through stone and spell as though they were paper. The screams of the dying mixed with the roar of dragon fire. The sky itself seemed to burn as lightning crackled between the ancient beings and the defenders of the Golden Order. Granzax's body, frozen in time as it pierced the city's walls, still serves as a monument to that terrible day when the dragons reminded the Golden Order that older powers still remembered their ancient claims. The corpse remains there even in the time of the Tarnished, a permanent scar on the perfect facade of the capital, a reminder that Marika's empire was built atop the bones of older kingdoms. In this hour of crisis, when the very foundations of the empire trembled beneath the assault of beings that had ruled when the world was young, Godwyn stepped forward. He was not yet the seasoned warrior he would become. He was still young, still untested in true battle, but in him burned the divine fire of his lineage and the unshakable conviction that the Golden Order represented not just his mother's will, but humanity's destiny. The young prince took to the field, not merely as a demigod fulfilling his duty, but as a champion of everything the Erdtree represented. He carried with him the hopes of an entire civilization, the weight of his father's martial legacy, and his mother's divine authority. He understood that this was more than a battle. It was a statement about whether the new order could withstand challenges from the old powers, whether the future Marika envisioned could actually come to pass. The war raged for days, perhaps weeks. The historical records are unclear, and time itself may have moved strangely during those apocalyptic battles. Godwyn led his forces with a combination of tactical brilliance and personal courage that earned him the respect of even the most hardened veterans. He fought on the front lines, his blade flashing in the firelight, his voice rallying defenders who might otherwise have broken before the dragon's ancient majesty. But the war's true climax came when Godwyn the Golden faced Fortissax, known as the mightiest of the Boulderstone Drakes and renowned for its mastery of twin red lightning stakes. This confrontation was not simply a battle between two powerful beings. It was a meeting between different epochs of the world's history, a clash between philosophies of power and governance that had existed since the world's beginning. Fortissax embodied the primordial power of the ancient dragon's creatures, whose bodies were carved from living stone and whose breath was the very lightning that split the sky. The dragon had seen civilizations rise and fall. It had witnessed the crucible's chaos and the ordering of the world into distinct forms. It represented tradition, continuity with the ancient past, and the belief that power belonged to those who had held it since time immemorial. Against this avatar of the old world stood Godwyn, young and untested, carrying only his courage and the hopes of a civilization that had dared to dream of surpassing the achievements of those who came before. He represented change, progress, the belief that the world could be made better through wisdom and will rather than simply accepting the patterns established in ages past. The battle between them must have been spectacular. Fortissax's red lightning stakes, each capable of leveling buildings, crashing against Godwyn's defenses. The dragon's massive tail, formed of living stone, smashing craters into the earth. Its ancient voice, speaking in languages older than human speech, pronouncing judgments on the arrogance of the Golden Order. And against all this, Godwyn fought with the fury of youth and conviction. His blade found gaps in stone scales. His tactical genius anticipated the dragon's movements. His divine heritage gave him strength beyond mortal limits. But more than any of these advantages, Godwyn possessed something that would prove decisive: the capacity for wisdom that transcended simple victory. What happened next would resonate through the ages, becoming the stuff of legend and fundamentally altering the course of history. Godwyn defeated Fortissax in single combat, proving his martial prowess beyond any doubt. But he did not kill his fallen foe. Instead, in a moment that would define his entire legacy, he befriended the Ancient Dragon. This decision, to offer mercy and friendship rather than deliver the killing blow, was revolutionary. In the brutal calculus of divine politics, enemies were to be destroyed or subjugated, not befriended. Marika herself had built her empire on the destruction of those who opposed her vision. The fire giants had been nearly exterminated. The ancient dynasty that had ruled before her had been overthrown. The pattern was clear. Enemies were meant to be eliminated. But Godwyn saw something different. He recognized in Fortissax not just a defeated enemy, but a worthy adversary who could become an even worthier ally. The dragon possessed knowledge and power that stretched back to the world's beginning. Its wisdom encompassed ages that no mortal or even demigod could comprehend. To destroy such a being would be to erase irreplaceable knowledge, to lose access to perspectives that could never be recovered. Moreover, Godwyn understood something profound about power itself. True strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to integrate former enemies into a larger vision. The Dragon War had proven that the Golden Order could defeat the ancient powers through force of arms. But Godwyn's friendship with Fortissax would prove something far more valuable, that the new order could be enriched rather than threatened by the wisdom of the old. The Ancient Dragon, for its part, recognized in Godwyn qualities that commanded respect. Here was no arrogant young god drunk on victory, but a warrior who honored his fallen opponent. Here was wisdom beyond years, a capacity for mercy that spoke to deeper understanding of power and its uses. Fortissax, who had lived for uncounted centuries, who had seen countless warriors come and go, chose to accept Godwyn's offer of friendship. From this unprecedented bond arose the ancient dragon cult of the royal capital. This was not merely a political alliance or a peace treaty. It was a formal integration of the old powers into the new order, a recognition that the wisdom and strength of the ancient dragons could complement rather than threaten the Golden Order's vision for the world. The cult was championed by Godwyn the Golden in collaboration with Ancient Dragon Fortissax and the dreadful Fortissax after the conclusion of the war between Lendel and the dragons. These beings, who had fought against each other with the fury of apocalyptic forces, now stood together as allies and teachers. The implications were staggering. The theological foundations of the ancient dragon cult revealed something crucial about the nature of power in the lands between. Worship of the ancient dragons did not conflict with faith in the Erdtree, because the dragon's lightning was imbued with gold. This shared elemental affinity suggested that despite their different origins, both the dragons and the Erdtree drew from the same fundamental source of power, that primordial gold that predated even Marika's ascension. This harmonious blending of ancient and modern, of primordial power and divine order, represented the very best of what the Golden Age could achieve. It showed that progress need not come at the expense of wisdom, that new forms of divinity could embrace rather than destroy the sacred traditions of the past. In the ancient dragon cult, the lessons of ages past were preserved and integrated into the Golden Order's forward-looking vision. Through his friendship with Fortissax, Godwyn learned to channel the dragon's power to summon storms of golden lightning. This was far more than simply acquiring a new weapon or magical ability. It represented a fundamental evolution in Godwyn's nature, a synthesis of mortal determination and draconic might, of divine heritage and primordial power. The lightning he commanded was not merely destructive force, but a manifestation of the principle the Golden Order hoped to embody, the transformation of raw power into enlightened purpose. When Godwyn called down his golden lightning, he was not just wielding the fury of the storm, but demonstrating how different sources of power could be united in service of a greater vision. The prince's inner circle of elite ancient dragon knights formed his personal guard, and they received the largest amber medallions ever bestowed. These knights represented the culmination of Godwyn's vision warriors, who had mastered both the martial traditions of the Golden Order and the ancient wisdom of the dragons. They wore their amber medallions not as mere decorations, but as symbols of their participation in something unprecedented. These medallions, treasured as the most precious of jewels in the Age of Godfrey, represented the formal recognition of the ancient dragon cult's place within the Golden Order. They were tangible proof that the old powers and new order could coexist, that tradition and progress were not incompatible. Each medallion was a promise, that wisdom would be preserved, that ancient knowledge would be honored, that the future would be built on respect for the past rather than its destruction. The cult's practices integrated dragon worship into the broader framework of the Golden Order. Devotees learned to channel draconic power, to call upon ancient lightning, to embody the synthesis of human will and primordial force. They studied the history of the dragons, learning of ages when the world was young and all things were possible. They trained with weapons that crackled with golden electricity, each strike a reminder of the friendship between prince and dragon. But the ancient dragon cult was more than military might or magical practice. It was a philosophical statement about the nature of civilization itself. It demonstrated that strength could be tempered with wisdom, that victory need not require the complete destruction of one's enemies, that the most lasting peace was built on mutual respect rather than subjugation. Fortissax himself became a fixture at the royal capital, his massive form a common sight in the skies above Leyndell. The citizens grew accustomed to seeing their prince riding upon the back of a being that had once been their enemy, now transformed into their protector. Children who had cowered in fear during the Dragon War now looked up in wonder at the partnership between mortal and immortal, between new order and ancient power. The relationship between Godwyn and Fortissax deepened over the years that followed. They were not merely allies but genuine friends, each learning from the other in ways that transformed them both. Godwyn gained access to knowledge and perspectives that spanned millennia. Fortissax, in turn, discovered in the young prince qualities that even his ancient wisdom had not anticipated, a capacity for growth and change that made mockery of the dragon's assumptions about mortal limitations. This friendship would become the cornerstone of Godwyn's legend. It proved that he was more than just a mighty warrior or a divinely favored prince. He was a builder of bridges, a creator of unity where others saw only division. In befriending Fortissax, Godwyn had accomplished something that would have seemed impossible before their meeting. He had shown that the cycle of violence between old and new powers could be broken, that a better way forward was possible. In the years following the Dragon War, Godwyn reached the pinnacle of his influence and power. He had proven himself as a warrior, demonstrated wisdom beyond his years as a diplomat, and shown the kind of visionary leadership that could reshape the world itself. The ancient dragon cult flourished under his patronage, becoming not just a religious movement but a bridge between different eras of the world's history. The prince who had befriended dragons commanded respect from the highest to the lowest ranks of society. Nobles sought his counsel on matters of state. Common soldiers would have followed him into any battle, confident that his leadership would see them through. Even other demigods, those half-siblings whose relationships were often fraught with jealousy and competition, regarded Godwyn with a mixture of respect and genuine affection. Godwyn was protected by a personal entourage in addition to the royal palace guard. These were not merely soldiers assigned to protect a valuable political asset, but devoted followers who had witnessed firsthand the transformative power of his leadership. They had seen him face down ancient dragons in battle and emerge victorious. They had watched him extend mercy to defeated enemies and forge lasting alliances from the ashes of war. They had learned from his example that strength and compassion were not opposing virtues, but complementary aspects of true leadership. Yet for all his achievements, Godwyn remained remarkably humble. Unlike some of his half-siblings who would later retreat into isolated pursuits of personal power, Godwyn understood that his gifts were meant to serve something greater than himself. He was the heir apparent not just to a throne, but to a vision of what the world could become under enlightened rule. Every action he took, every alliance he forged, every enemy he chose to spare rather than destroy was guided by this larger purpose. He saw himself not as a demigod to be worshipped, but as a steward of something precious, the dream of a world where wisdom ruled, where ancient enmities could be transcended, where power was exercised with restraint and purpose. The medallions of the largest variety were conferred to Godwyn's inner circle of distinguished golden knights. These amber medallions represented more than wealth or status. They were tangible symbols of participation in something unprecedented, the creation of a new form of governance that could unite ancient powers with modern wisdom, that could honor the past while building toward a more enlightened future. During this golden period, Godwyn's influence extended far beyond military conquest or political maneuvering. He became a cultural icon, a living embodiment of the Golden Order's highest ideals. His very presence at court functions or public ceremonies drew crowds, who came not merely to see a prince, but to witness someone who seemed to have achieved perfect harmony between power and wisdom, strength and mercy. Stories spread throughout the lands between of Godwyn's deeds and character. Merchants traveling the roads would speak of the Golden Prince who had befriended dragons. Soldiers returning from campaigns would tell of his courage in battle and his mercy toward the defeated. Scholars in distant academies would debate the theological implications of the ancient dragon cult and what it meant for the evolution of the Golden Order. The prince's relationship with his family during this period appears to have been remarkably warm. especially considering the often fraught dynamics that plagued other demigod siblings. There is a statue in the Haligtree of an adult figure, embracing the twin Empyreans Malenia and Miquella. The crown worn by this figure is too dissimilar to Marika's elaborate headdress to be the goddess herself, suggesting this is most likely Godwyn. This touching image reveals something profound about the Golden Prince's character. Despite the vast differences in their circumstances, Godwyn basking in public acclaim, while his younger half-siblings struggled with their respective curses, he maintained genuine affection for his family. He did not allow his own success to create distance between himself and those who suffered. The relationship between Godwyn and Miquella appears to have been particularly close. Miquella, trapped in eternal childhood by his curse, possessed wisdom and compassion that transcended his frozen youth. In Godwyn, Miquella found not just an older brother, but a kindred spirit who shared his vision of a better world. Evidence suggests that Miquella harbored deep love and respect for his older brother, feelings that would later manifest in desperate attempts to grant Godwyn a true death after his assassination. The relationship between Godwyn and Malenia, the blade of Miquella who fought constantly against the scarlet rot consuming her body, appears to have been similarly warm based on this depiction. Where others might have pitied or feared the rotting demigod, the statue shows acceptance and embrace. This suggests someone who recognized her strength not just as a warrior, but as someone who refused to surrender to the curse that afflicted her. Even his brothers Morgott and Mohg, the Omen twins who had been imprisoned beneath Lendel since birth, appear to have maintained some connection to their golden brother. The name of Mohg's dynasty, Mohgwyn, seems to be a combination of his own name and Godwyn's, suggesting that despite being separated by the vast gulf between acceptable and unacceptable royal offspring, Mohg retained enough love and respect for Godwyn to honor him in the very name of his rebellion. This capacity for familial love, for maintaining connections across vast differences in fortune and circumstance, marked Godwyn as exceptional even among demigods. He could have easily adopted the attitude of many nobility, that those born with curses or deformities were somehow lesser, that his own perfection marked him as superior. Instead, he chose empathy and connection. The golden age of Godwyn's influence saw the royal capital of Lendel reach heights of prosperity and cultural achievement that would never be equaled. The ancient dragon cult attracted scholars and devotees from across the lands between, making Lendel not just a center of political power, but a hub of learning and spiritual inquiry. The integration of draconic wisdom with the Golden Order's philosophy produced new understandings of magic, combat, and theology. Artists created works celebrating the friendship between Godwyn and Fortissax, depicting them as symbols of unity between mortal and immortal, new and old. Poets composed verses about the Golden Prince whose mercy had proven stronger than his sword, whose wisdom had transformed ancient enemies into beloved allies. Musicians wrote songs that told of his deeds in the Dragon War, of his courage on the battlefield, and his compassion in victory. During this period, Godwyn also took an active role in governing the lands between. He served as his mother's representative in various capacities, resolving disputes between noble houses, leading expeditions to pacify unruly territories, establishing new settlements in frontier regions. In every role, he demonstrated the same combination of strength and wisdom that had defined his friendship with Fortissax. Those who served under Godwyn during these years would later recall them as the best of their lives. The Golden Prince inspired a kind of loyalty that went beyond duty or fear. His followers believed in him, not because they had to, but because he had proven himself worthy of belief. They fought harder because they knew he would never waste their lives needlessly. They showed mercy when appropriate because they had learned from his example that strength was secure enough to be gentle. Yet even as Godwyn stood at the height of his power and influence, forces were gathering that would bring his golden age to a sudden and tragic end. The very success of the Golden Order, the unprecedented stability and prosperity it had brought to the lands between, had created new tensions and resentments among those who felt marginalized by Marika's reign. And in the shadows, plans were being laid that would shatter everything Godwyn had built. The conspiracy that would destroy Godwyn was elaborate and far-reaching. born from philosophical disagreements that cut to the heart of what the Golden Order represented. Chief among the dissatisfied figures was Ranni the Witch, lunar princess and daughter of Queen Rennala and Radagon. Ranni looked upon the Golden Order's promise of eternal life and saw not paradise but prison. Where others saw the blessing of immortality, Ranni perceived the curse of endless servitude to cosmic forces beyond human understanding. The philosophical divide could not have been greater. Godwyn represented everything positive about the Golden Order: its capacity for growth, its ability to integrate former enemies, its promise of enlightened rule. He was living proof that the system could work, that divine authority could be exercised with wisdom and restraint. But to Ranni, these very achievements were evidence of a more fundamental problem: the reduction of thinking beings to instruments of alien will. As an Empyrean, one of the rare individuals capable of succeeding Marika as a vessel for the greater will, Ranni faced a particularly acute version of this dilemma. She possessed the power to reshape the world, but only if she accepted a role that would strip her of agency and autonomy. The path to godhood offered by the Two Fingers was not ascension but surrender, not empowerment but enslavement to forces that cared nothing for human desires or dreams. The Two Fingers, those grotesque appendages that served as conduits for the greater will's commands, represented everything she despised about the current order. They reduced complex moral and political questions to simple matters of obedience, transforming potential gods into mere executives of incomprehensible cosmic purpose. Ranni's solution was characteristically radical. If she could not escape her fate through conventional means, she would cheat death itself. Wishing to shed her Empyrean body but preserve her spirit, she knew that the spirit of someone else had to die as well. This was the cruel mathematics of the ritual she contemplated. To achieve spiritual freedom, she would need to sacrifice someone else's soul. The choice of Godwyn as this sacrificial victim was not arbitrary, though whether Ranni specifically selected him or whether he simply became the target through circumstance remains unclear from the historical record. From a strategic perspective, however, he represented the perfect target. His death would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. It would provide the spiritual sacrifice needed for Ranni's transformation. It would strike a devastating blow against Marika's stability. And it would eliminate the most capable potential successor to the current order. Godwyn's very virtues made him dangerous to those who sought radical change. His success in integrating the dragons, his popularity among the people, his apparent immunity to the curses that plagued other demigods, all of these factors marked him as someone who could potentially lead a reformed, but still fundamentally unchanged Golden Order into the future. For revolutionaries like Ranni, who sought not reform but replacement, such a figure posed an existential threat to their ambitions. The conspiracy required several elements to succeed. First, Ranni needed to steal a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malekith, the Black Blade, who served as Queen Marika's shadow and the guardian of destined death. This was no simple theft. Malekith was one of the most formidable warriors in existence, utterly devoted to Marika, and charged with protecting the very force that the Golden Order had sealed away to create its immortal civilization. How Ranni accomplished this theft remains one of the great mysteries of the Shattering. Some scholars suggest she had help from within Marika's own circle. Others theorize she exploited knowledge gained through Hercarian sorcery, perhaps creating illusions or manipulations that confused even Malekith's formidable senses. What is certain is that she succeeded in obtaining a fragment of death itself enough to forge weapons that could kill even gods. With the stolen fragment, Ranni proceeded to imbue the black knives of Numen assassins with the power of destined death. The choice of assassins was itself significant. The assassins that carried out the deeds of the Knight of the Black Knives were all women, rumored to be Numen who had close ties with Marika herself. This created a web of implication and suspicion that would poison relationships throughout the royal family for generations to come. Were these women acting independently, following Ranni's commands, or pursuing an agenda connected to Marika herself? The question would never be definitively answered, adding layers of paranoia and mistrust to an already tragic situation. Some whisper even now that Marika somehow orchestrated or allowed her own son's assassination, though for what purpose remains incomprehensible. The weapons themselves were marvels of dark purpose, forged through forbidden ritual. A specific ceremony performed on the oddly misshapen blades imbued them with the power of the stolen rune of death. To understand the significance of this, one must appreciate that the rune of death represented the fundamental force of termination that Marika had sealed away when establishing the Golden Order. By freeing this power and incorporating it into physical weapons, Ranni had essentially created instruments of absolute ending blades that could cut through immortality itself. On the night of the plot, the assassins arrived in Lendel, the royal capital, moving through shadows with supernatural stealth. They bypassed guards and magical wards, their movements coordinated with precision that suggested extensive planning and reconnaissance. The Black Knives found their targets with unerring accuracy, striking at multiple locations simultaneously in a display of tactical sophistication that still amazes military scholars. And then they struck. Godwyn the Golden, the beloved prince who had befriended dragons and unified the realm, was slain. The Black Knives carved the curse mark of death into his flesh, a ritual killing designed to ensure that death, once unleashed, could not be reversed or undone. The curse mark was supposed to form a complete circle, a perfect seal that would guarantee true death. But something went wrong, or perhaps terribly right from Ranni's perspective. As both Ranni and Godwyn died at the same time, the curse mark split into two half-wheels. This division would have consequences that neither conspirator anticipated, creating a form of fractured death that left both victims trapped in states that were neither fully alive nor completely dead. Godwyn's soul alone perished, while Ranni became the first demigod to die in the flesh. The asymmetry of this double death created something unprecedented and horrifying. A being whose body lived on without the animating spirit that had made it human, and another whose spirit endured without the physical form that had housed it. For Godwyn, this meant something far worse than simple death. His body, denied the release of true termination, began to undergo transformations that violated every natural law. In the absence of a soul, deprived of the consciousness that should have guided its continued existence, his body began to change according to patterns that had nothing to do with life, as anyone understood it. The morning after the night of Black Knives, chaos erupted throughout Lendel. Guards discovered the Golden Prince's body in his chambers, the curse mark carved into his flesh still glowing with residual power. The assassination had been so precise, so perfectly executed, that Godwyn's personal guard, those elite warriors who had sworn to protect him with their lives, hadn't even known he was under attack until it was far too late. News of Godwyn's death spread through the capital like wildfire. Citizens who had gone to sleep in a world where their beloved prince safeguarded their future woke to find that world shattered. The streets filled with mourners. Strong men wept openly. The very stones of Lendel seemed to groan with collective grief. Queen Marika's response to her son's death was immediate and catastrophic. Whether driven by grief-maddened rage or calculated purpose, Marika shattered the Elden Ring. The shattering of the Elden Ring represented not just a political crisis, but a metaphysical catastrophe that unraveled the fundamental laws governing reality in the lands between. To understand the magnitude of this act, one must appreciate that the Elden Ring was not merely a symbol of political authority, but the cosmic framework that held existence itself together. By destroying it, Marika essentially broke the world, creating a situation where the basic rules of life, death, space, and time became negotiable rather than absolute. Whether this was an act of pure grief or a calculated decision, perhaps even one planned before Godwyn's death, remains one of the great mysteries that scholars continue to debate. The conflict that followed broke a vast and prosperous empire into brittle fragments. No single side could find enough purchase to maintain a decisive victory, even when fueled by the power of a great rune. The fragments of the shattered Elden Ring became great runes, each one containing enough power to transform its bearer into a demigod-level entity. But rather than providing the tools for reconstruction, these fragments became prizes in an endless war of succession. In the absence of a soul, Godwyn's body transformed into what would become known as the Prince of Death. What had once been the Golden Prince, exemplar of everything noble and beautiful about the divine order, became a grotesque parody of life. a thing that existed in direct contradiction to everything he had once represented. The transformation was not immediate but gradual, a slow corruption that spread from the curse mark carved into his flesh. The golden-haired Prince of Death grew to immense size, his body expanding far beyond human proportions. He developed a scaly fish-like tail and webbed forearms reminiscent of basilisks, as though his form was reaching back to some primordial template of life that predated human consciousness. Death blight erupted from his body, drawing swarms of buzzing flies. These insects were not ordinary carrion feeders, but something stranger creatures that seemed to exist in the liminal space between life and death, feeding not on decay but on the paradox of existence without animation. They swarmed around Godwyn's growing form in clouds, so thick they appeared as dark fog. His face warped into something that barely resembled anything human. It became a grotesque fungal-like disc, features smoothed into an almost featureless expanse marked only by the hollow pits, where eyes once sparkled with wisdom and kindness. Those eyes were drained of all color, becoming empty windows into a consciousness that no longer existed. This was not mere physical corruption, but a fundamental violation of the natural order. Godwyn's body, deprived of the soul that should have guided its development, began to grow according to alien patterns. The princely form that had once commanded dragons and inspired devotion became something that hurt to look upon, a mass of flesh and scale that bore only the faintest resemblance to its original configuration. His Erdtree burial, intended as the highest honor that could be bestowed upon the fallen prince, instead became the vector for spreading his corruption. The body was interred beneath Lendel, at the base of the Erdtree's roots in the deep-root depths. This placement, meant to return his essence to the great tree that sustained all life in the lands between, instead infected those same roots with death itself. Godwyn's spirit could not return to the Erdtree because he did not experience a true death. The incomplete nature of his assassination had created a theological crisis that the Golden Order was unprepared to handle. All their rituals and ceremonies assumed the fundamental distinction between life and death, but Godwyn's condition defied these categories entirely. Through Godwyn, the rune of death seeped into the Erdtree roots and spread throughout the lands between. Like poison introduced into a circulatory system, the corruption carried by Godwyn's incomplete death began to manifest everywhere the roots touched. The irony of this situation was profound. Godwyn, who had spent his life building connections between different parts of the world, became in death a source of contamination that spread through those same connections. Soon after his burial, the Death Prince's distorted visage manifested itself across the realm. His empty eyes peered out from tendrils and vines. His warped face materialized in places of Erdtree burial, replacing the golden radiance that should have marked these sacred sites with something dark and horrifying. Walking through what should have been consecrated ground, one might suddenly find Godwyn's corrupted features, staring back from the bark of trees or the surface of memorial stones. The corruption sprouted deathroot wherever it took hold. These growths appeared like dark cancers on the body of the world, twisted vegetative forms that pulsed with unnatural life. The deathroot served both as symptom of the world's sickness and as source of further contamination, creating new undead wherever it established itself. Godwyn's main body rests at the Prince of Death's throne, located in a shallow pool of purple water at the base of a tainted root in the deep-root depths. The setting itself tells a story of how far he had fallen. What should have been a place of honor and rest had become a grotesque scene of corruption. The throne is less a seat of power and more a prison. The purple water is not a ceremonial pool, but a stagnant pond of decay. The body itself had grown to truly immense proportions by the time it settled into this configuration. The scaly fishtail extends dozens of feet, while the webbed forearms resemble the grasping appendages of some deep-sea horror. Death blight erupts from multiple points along the body's surface, and the swarms of flies have grown so thick they form almost a physical barrier around the throne. Yet even in this corrupted state, some vestige of Godwyn's protective nature seems to remain. Although the Prince of Death is the source of the death blight that spreads throughout the lands between, the Prince of Death's throne itself is harmless to those who approach it. Unlike other sources of death blight corruption that actively assault the living, Godwyn's primary body poses no direct threat to visitors who come with peaceful intent. Whether this represents some fragment of the Golden Prince's merciful nature, surviving the destruction of his soul, or simply a quirk of how the corruption manifests, remains a subject of speculation among those who study such matters. Like his mother Marika, who would later be imprisoned within the Erd Tree, Godwyn is suspended in his corrupted state, strung up in his pool of decay, neither alive nor dead. Both are referred to as martyrs in the lore, though what exactly they are martyrs to remains open to interpretation. This parallel between mother and son adds another layer of tragedy to an already devastating story. Godwyn's cadaver surrogates began appearing in various locations throughout the lands between. These manifestations, thought to be fragments of his corrupted essence that had spread through the root system, appeared at Fringefolk Hero's grave, Death-Futched catacombs, and most significantly beneath Stormvale Castle. Each surrogate represented another node in a network of death that spanned the continent, another location where the Prince of Death's influence had taken permanent root. The surrogate beneath Stormvale Castle would prove particularly significant. Its discovery by the sorcerer Rogier would ultimately provide crucial evidence about the Knight of Black Knives and the conspiracy that had brought down the Golden Order's greatest champion. But the encounter would cost Rogier dearly. Contact with the cadaver surrogate infected him with death blight, beginning the slow corruption that would eventually claim his life. One of the most profound consequences of Godwyn's assassination was the emergence of an entirely new category of existence, those who live in death. This umbrella term encompasses the skeletons and other undead beings that began appearing throughout the lands between in the aftermath of Godwyn's corruption, creatures that exist in direct violation of the binary between life and death that the Golden Order had sought to maintain. Before Godwyn's death, the concept of undeath was essentially unknown in the lands between. Queen Marika had sealed away the rune of death specifically to prevent such aberrations. In her vision of the Golden Order, beings were either alive blessed with the immortality granted by the Erd Tree's grace, or they experienced destined death and returned to the tree to be reborn. There was no middle ground, no liminal state between existence and non-existence. Godwyn's incomplete death shattered this neat dichotomy. His soulless body, spreading corruption through the Erd Tree's roots, created the conditions for a new form of existence. Beings began rising from their graves, animated by the same paradoxical force that kept Godwyn's body functioning despite the absence of his soul. They were not alive in any conventional sense. They did not breathe, did not age, did not truly think or feel as the living do. But neither were they simply dead, for they moved and acted with purpose, however degraded and confused that purpose might be. The Golden Order aligned itself against those who live in death, seeing them as mockery of the natural order. From the perspective of the established authorities, these creatures were abominations that violated the fundamental principles upon which reality was supposed to operate. They represented everything the Golden Order had sought to prevent: chaos, corruption, the contamination of pure life with the taint of death. Golden Order fundamentalism, the strict religious philosophy that guided the most orthodox followers of the Erd Tree, declared those who live in death to be blasphemies against the greater will. Hunting them became a sacred duty. The Golden Order's champions made it their mission to destroy these undead wherever they appeared, burning their bodies to ensure they could not rise again, purifying corrupted sites with holy incantations. Yet from another perspective, those who live in death represented something potentially liberating. While immortality had been given to all people in the world under the Golden Order, this so-called blessing came with strings attached. The demigods were bound to the greater will's purpose. Common folk found their lives stretched into centuries of repetitive existence under the unchanging rule of an immortal elite. To many, this seemed to take away the meaning of life itself, transforming existence into an endless present without the stakes that made choices meaningful. Death had given life its weight, its urgency, its precious nature. When death was sealed away, life became cheap, something that could always be extended, always be prolonged, always be recovered from. Some began to feel that true freedom required liberation from the outer god's control, a restoration of death to its natural place in the cosmic order. Those who live in death, paradoxically, offered a form of existence outside both life and death, as defined by the Golden Order. They answered to no god, followed no cosmic mandate. Their existence was abhorrent, yes, but it was also autonomous in a way that neither the immortal subjects of the Golden Order nor those granted destined death could claim to be. These undead worshipped Godwyn as the Prince of Death, believing he would eventually return and lead them. In their degraded consciousness, they perceived him not as a victim of tragedy, but as a pioneer who had opened new pathways of existence. They gathered at sites where his corruption was strongest, in catacombs and burial grounds where Deathroot had taken hold. They built crude shrines to his memory, adorning them with whatever they could find, fragments of golden armor, wilted flowers, crude carvings that attempted to capture his former glory. This worship was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The consciousness that had made Godwyn a leader worth following was gone, destroyed in the assassination that had claimed his soul. What remained was a body guided by alien impulses, responding to instincts and drives that had no connection to the wisdom and compassion that had defined the living prince. Yet the devotion of those who live in death to Godwyn revealed something poignant about the human need for meaning and purpose. Even in their corrupted state, stripped of everything that made them human, they still sought a leader, still craved purpose, still yearned to believe that their existence served some greater design. They looked at Godwyn's corrupted form and saw not a horror, but a kindred spirit, the first to experience the liminal state between life and death that now defined their own existence. The relationship between Godwyn and those who live in death mirrors, in grotesque fashion, his relationship with the ancient dragons during his life. Just as he had befriended Fortissax and integrated dragon worship into the Golden Order, his death created a following among beings who existed outside that order's framework. But where his living friendships enriched and elevated everyone involved, his posthumous influence created only corruption and suffering. The emergence of those who live in death represented a theological crisis for the Golden Order. It proved that Marika's attempt to seal away death and create a perfect immortal civilization had failed. Death had returned, but in a corrupted form that violated the natural cycles she had sought to establish. Rather than experiencing destined death and returning peacefully to the Erdtree, beings were now trapped in states of undeath that served neither life nor death. Different factions within the lands between responded to this crisis in different ways. The Golden Order fundamentalists doubled down on their orthodoxy, declaring that stricter adherence to the current system was the only solution. If the undead existed, it was because people had strayed from the greater will's design. The solution was to hunt down every last undead creature and restore purity through force. Others saw the undead as evidence that the Golden Order itself was the problem. If sealing death had created such horrific consequences, perhaps the solution was to restore death to its natural place, to accept endings as necessary parts of existence rather than enemies to be defeated. This thinking would eventually coalesce into movements like the one championed by Fia, the deathbed companion, who sought to grant Godwyn a proper death and establish an age of Duskborn, where life and death coexisted in natural balance. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Godwyn's posthumous existence is the story of Ancient Dragon Fortissax, the mighty being who had once been his enemy and had become his closest friend. After Godwyn the Golden became the Prince of Death, the ancient dragon fought long and hard against the death within its companion. This represents loyalty of an almost incomprehensible depth. Fortissax, one of the mightiest beings in existence, a creature whose lifespan encompassed ages of the world, chose to follow his friend into the realm of death itself. The dragon could have accepted Godwyn's fate and moved on, could have returned to his ancient kin and resumed his existence as an immortal being above the petty concerns of mortals and demigods. But Fortissax did not abandon his friend. Instead, the dragon entered Godwyn's dying consciousness, venturing into the landscape of a mind being slowly consumed by death blight. This was not a battle that could be won through physical strength or magical power, but a struggle against the fundamental forces of corruption and decay. Imagine the nature of this internal war. Fortissax, a being of living stone and golden lightning, fighting within the mindscape of someone whose soul had been destroyed. The dragon navigated thoughts that made no sense, memories that led nowhere, identity fragments that could not coalesce into anything resembling consciousness. All around, the death blight spread its corruption, not as physical rot, but as existential void, the erasure of meaning and purpose. For who knows how long, Fortissax maintained this vigil. Days? Month? Years? Time moves strangely in the realm of consciousness, especially in a mind as damaged as Godwyn's. The dragon fought alone, without respite, against an enemy that could not be defeated through conventional means. Every victory was temporary. Every bit of consciousness preserved from corruption represented only a delay, not a solution. The dragon's motivation was not duty but love. Fortissax and Godwyn had been true friends, bound by respect and affection that transcended the vast differences between their natures. The young prince had shown mercy when he could have shown cruelty. He had offered friendship when enmity would have been expected. He had demonstrated that beings from different eras of the world's history could find common ground. For Fortissax, abandoning Godwyn to face corruption alone would have been a betrayal of everything their friendship represented. So the dragon fought on, season after season, holding back the tide of death blight through sheer determination. The dragon channeled its ancient power into preserving whatever fragments of Godwyn's consciousness might remain, hoping against hope that some cure might be found, some way to reverse what had been done. But alas, victory was never achieved, and the only reward for Fortissax's devotion was corruption. The death blight that consumed Godwyn began to infect the dragon as well. Slowly, inevitably, the corruption spread through Fortissax's ancient form. Scales that had withstood the ages began to rot and fall away. Lightning that had once crackled pure and golden became tainted with the purple-black energy of death. The dragon's transformation into the Lich Dragon Fortissax represents one of the most complete tragedies in the entire mythology of the lands between. This mighty being who had seen civilizations rise and fall, who had fought the Golden Order to a standstill, and then befriended its greatest champion, was reduced to a rotting horror, consumed by the very corruption it had sought to prevent. When you encounter Lich Dragon Fortissax in the depths of Godwyn's deathbed dream, you're facing not a magnificent ancient dragon at the height of its power, but a loyal friend who has sacrificed everything in a futile attempt to save someone he loved. Much of the dragon's scales have been torn off. You can physically see the death blight infecting Fortissax's wounds. The dragon's whole body has rotted black from the corruption, transforming golden majesty into a nightmare of decay. The battle against Lich Dragon Fortissax is thus not a conquest but a mercy killing, not a victory over an enemy, but the final act in a friendship between a prince and a dragon. When you strike the killing blow, you're ending not just Fortissax's suffering, but concluding a chapter of loyalty and devotion that spans from the heights of the Golden Age to the depths of death itself. This is why Fortissax may seem easier to defeat than a dragon of its legendary status should be. The dragon has been fighting Godwyn's death blight for an unknown length of time, wearing itself down in an unwinnable battle. You're simply there to finish what the corruption started, to grant the dragon the release it can no longer achieve for itself. The tragedy of Fortissax's sacrifice cannot be overstated. This was a being that could have been immortal in more than just the literal sense. Its legend could have persisted through the ages as one of the mightiest dragons ever to exist. Instead, Fortissax chose friendship over glory, chose loyalty over survival, and in doing so demonstrated qualities that rival even Godwyn's own nobility of spirit. In the end, both friends were destroyed by the Night of Black Knives. Godwyn lost his soul and became a spreading horror. Fortissax lost its physical magnificence and ancient might in a doomed attempt to save what had already been lost. Their friendship, which had once represented hope for reconciliation between different eras and different forms of existence, became a monument to the cruelty of fate and the terrible costs of devotion. The impact of Godwyn's death extended far beyond political and cosmic consequences. It shattered the hearts of those who had loved him, creating waves of grief and anguish that would shape the actions of multiple demigods in the years that followed. Perhaps no one felt Godwyn's loss more acutely than Miquella the Kind, who would later be known as Miquella the Unalloyed. The relationship between these two half-brothers appears to have transcended the typical political calculations that governed most interactions between demigods. Where others saw potential rivals or useful allies, Miquella and Godwyn seem to have found genuine fraternal affection. The depth of Miquella's grief is captured in the inscription on the golden epitaph, a sword made to commemorate the death of Godwyn the Golden, first of the demigods to die. The weapon bears the prayer, "O brother, Lord brother, please die a true death." These words, so simple yet so laden with anguish, reveal the particular cruelty of Godwyn's fate. It was not enough that he had been murdered. His very death had been incomplete, trapping him in a state that denied him even the dignity of proper rest. For Miquella, who possessed wisdom beyond his eternally youthful appearance, and who had dedicated himself to curing seemingly incurable afflictions, his brother's condition must have represented the ultimate frustration. Here was a problem that all his knowledge and power could not solve. The young Empyrean had already devoted himself to finding cures for various curses and afflictions. He sought to cure his sister Malenia of the scarlet rot that consumed her. He experimented with unalloyed gold, attempting to create a form of divine power that could resist the influence of outer gods. His entire philosophy centered on the belief that even the most terrible curses could be overcome through wisdom and compassion. But Godwyn's condition defied all of Miquella's efforts. The problem wasn't that the Golden Prince was dead. Miquella could have accepted that, mourned properly, and moved on. The problem was that Godwyn existed in a state that violated the fundamental nature of existence itself. His body lived without a soul. His influence spread corruption, even as some vestige of his protective nature seemed to persist. He was trapped between states, unable to move forward into true death or backward into life. Many figures, including his half-brother Miquella and his companion Fortissax, tried to cure him of his condition and allow him a proper death, but to no avail. Each failure must have been devastating for Miquella, another reminder that some problems exceeded even his considerable abilities. The golden epitaph's inscription represents not just a prayer, but admission of defeat. Miquella, acknowledging that he cannot save his brother, can only beg for his release. The statue in the halictree provides another glimpse into the warmth that existed within this fractured family. There stands a statue of an adult figure embracing the twin Empyreans Malenia and Miquella, based on the crown's design, which differs significantly from Marika's elaborate headdress. This figure is likely Godwyn rather than the goddess herself. The image of the Golden Prince, tenderly holding his younger half-siblings, speaks to an affection that transcended political considerations. This tenderness becomes even more poignant when we consider the curses that afflicted Miquella and Malenia. Miquella was trapped in eternal childhood, unable to age despite growing wisdom. Malenia fought constantly against the scarlet rot that consumed her from within. Godwyn, alone among his generation, had been born without any divine curse or corruption. He could have easily adopted the attitude of those nobility who look down upon the afflicted as somehow lesser, who see their own perfection as evidence of superior worthiness. Instead, the statue suggests he chose to offer comfort and protection, to use his advantages in service of those who had been less fortunate. He embraced his cursed siblings quite literally, refusing to let their afflictions create distance between them. Even his brothers Morgott and Moog, the Omen twins who had been imprisoned beneath Leyndell since birth, appear to have maintained some connection to their golden brother despite the vast gulf between acceptable and unacceptable royal offspring. The name of Moog's dynasty, Morgwyn, combines his own name with Godwyn's, suggesting that even this demigod who would later rebel against the Golden Order retained enough love and respect for the Golden Prince to honor him in the very name of his rebellion. This detail is particularly striking because Moog had every reason to hate Godwyn. While the Golden Prince lived in luxury and acclaim above ground, Moog rotted in sewers beneath the city, imprisoned simply for the crime of being born with horns. Yet even this justified resentment didn't erase Moog's love for his brother. In choosing to incorporate Godwyn's name into his dynasty, Moog was making a statement that his rebellion was against the system that had imprisoned him, not against the brother who had shown him whatever kindness was possible within that system's constraints. The Golden Order itself suffered its greatest loss with Godwyn's death. Here was not just another demigod seeking power for its own sake, but someone who had demonstrated the ability to transform ancient conflicts into lasting alliances, to extend mercy without weakness, and to lead with both strength and wisdom. Godwyn's success in ending the Dragon War had established a template for how the Golden Order could interact with forces that predated Marika's reign. Rather than seeking to destroy or subjugate ancient powers, he had shown they could be integrated into a larger vision of cosmic harmony. The ancient dragon cult that emerged from his friendship with Fortissax proved that the new order need not come at the expense of old wisdom. This approach stood in stark contrast to the methods typically employed by the Golden Order in its expansion. The conquest of the fire giants had ended in near genocide. The subjugation of various peoples had been achieved through force and fear. The systematic exclusion of omens and other, impure, beings had created a rigid hierarchy that left many feeling like outcasts in their own world. Godwyn's diplomatic triumph suggested an alternative path where growth came through alliance rather than conquest, where different forms of power and wisdom could coexist and enrich each other. Had he lived to inherit the throne, the lands between might have seen a very different form of divine rule. The shattering that followed his death created a situation where the worst aspects of divine ambition ran unchecked, where siblings became enemies and the land became an endless battlefield. Without Godwyn's moderating influence and unifying presence, the remaining demigods had no model for how power could be exercised responsibly, how former enemies could become valued allies, how mercy could be strength rather than weakness. Even more tragically, Godwyn's death had been orchestrated by someone who claimed to oppose the tyrannical aspects of the Golden Order. Ranni's rebellion was motivated by legitimate grievances about autonomy and freedom, about the right to determine one's own fate, rather than serving as a vessel for incomprehensible cosmic forces. But her methods ensured that the most enlightened potential leader of that order would never have the chance to reform it from within. In destroying Godwyn, Ranni eliminated not just an obstacle to change, but perhaps the best hope for positive evolution of the existing system. The question that haunts the lands between ever after is whether such radical change truly required such a terrible sacrifice, or whether patience and reform might have achieved similar goals without plunging the world into chaos. The story of Godwyn's influence reaches its culmination through the actions of Fear, the deathbed companion, a mysterious woman who saw in the Prince of Death not a horror to be destroyed, but a foundation upon which a new age could be built. Fear was the guardian of those who live in death, though this simple description barely captures the complexity of her role. She represented not just someone who ministered to the undead, but a religious leader who sought to transform their marginalized existence into a new form of cosmic order. In the world's rejection of those who live in death, Fear saw an injustice that demanded correction. Her philosophy stood in direct opposition to the Golden Order fundamentalism that sought to eradicate all undead as blasphemous aberrations. Fear argued that if the Golden Order's sealing of death had created those who live in death, then the solution was not to destroy them, but to grant their existence legitimate standing within the cosmic framework. They were, after all, proof that the Golden Order's vision was incomplete, that attempting to banish death entirely had simply created new forms of death that were more terrible than what came before. Having received the other half of the curse mark from Ranni's discarded body with help from a tarnished warrior, Fear embarked on a quest of profound intimacy and cosmic significance. She would lay with Godwyn, physically unite with the Prince of Death's corrupted form to grant him a second life as a true Prince of Death, rather than a mindless source of corruption. This act was simultaneously intimate and cosmic, personal and political. It required courage of a sort that few could comprehend, to willingly approach and embrace what had become the most horrifying manifestation of corruption in the entire lands between. But Fear understood something crucial. Godwyn's incomplete death was the problem, and only by completing his transformation could a solution be found. By uniting the two halves of the curse mark of death, Fear sought to restore a form of wholeness to Godwyn's fractured existence. The ritual was as much spiritual as physical, a sacrament that would acknowledge the Prince of Death's current state, while also elevating it to something purposeful rather than merely tragic. As a result of their union, Fia conceived a rune which a tarnished, seeking to become Elden Lord, might use to mend the Elden Ring, the mending rune of the Death Prince. This rune represented a radical reimagining of what the restored world could become. Rather than returning to the sterile immortality of the old Golden Order, this rune would create an age where death and life existed in harmony. The description of the mending rune of the Death Prince makes its purpose clear. Formed of the two half-wheel halves combined, it will embed the principle of life within death into order. The Golden Order was created by confining destined death. Thus, this new order will be one of death restored. This represented perhaps the most fitting tribute to Godwyn's legacy. Not the restoration of his personal life. That was impossible, his soul long since destroyed, but the transformation of his death into the foundation for a more complete and honest form of existence. The Age of Duskborn, as this potential new order came to be known, would be Godwyn's final gift to the world. Through his death, he had inadvertently created the conditions for a form of existence that transcended the limitations that had defined both life and death under the previous order. In this age, those who live in death would no longer be hunted as abominations but accepted as natural parts of the cosmic cycle. Death would return to its proper place, not as an enemy to be defeated but as a necessary counterpart to life. The Age of Duskborn would acknowledge what the Golden Order had tried to deny, that endings are natural, that cycles must complete, that attempting to freeze the world in eternal stasis creates more problems than it solves. It would restore the stakes that make life meaningful, the knowledge that our time is limited, that our choices matter because they cannot be endlessly revised, that loss is real and must be honored rather than denied. In championing this vision, Fia transformed Godwyn from a victim of tragedy into the cornerstone of renewal. The Prince of Death would not return as the Golden Prince he had been. That was impossible. But his corrupted existence could become sacred rather than profane, purposeful rather than merely horrific. Those who worshipped him would no longer be deluded cultists, but legitimate adherents of a cosmic principle that deserved recognition. Fia herself did not survive to see whether the Age of Duskborn would come to pass. Like so many who became entangled in Godwyn's fate, she paid the ultimate price for her devotion. After conceiving the mending rune, she passed away, her life's purpose fulfilled. She had given everything, her safety, her future, ultimately her life, to transform Godwyn's death from meaningless tragedy into meaningful foundation for change. Whether the Age of Duskborn represents true progress or simply a different form of corruption remains a matter of perspective. To the Golden Order's faithful, it is blasphemy, the elevation of death-touched aberrations to cosmic significance. To those who live in death and their sympathizers, it is liberation, the acknowledgement that existence takes many forms, and that the Golden Order's narrow definitions of life and death had always been inadequate to encompass reality's full complexity. But what's undeniable is that Fia's quest represents a form of love and devotion that rivals even Fortissax's doomed vigil. She looked upon what Godwyn had become and saw not just horror but potential. She willingly embraced corruption to give the Prince of Death the dignity that had been stolen from him, and she created the possibility that his suffering might ultimately serve a greater purpose. And so we come to the end of our journey through the tragic tale of Godwyn the Golden, though his story itself knows no ending. In the depths beneath the Erd Tree, where light never penetrates and time moves according to alien rhythms, the Prince of Death maintains his eternal vigil. His body has grown beyond all recognition. His mind has been scattered to the winds of eternity, but his influence continues to shape the world in ways both subtle and profound. From the Golden Prince, who commanded dragons and inspired devotion, to the corrupted mass of flesh and scale that spreads death blight through the roots of the world, Godwyn's transformation represents one of the most complete falls from grace in the entire mythology of the lands between. Yet it also represents something more, a reminder that even the most terrible curses can become the foundation for new forms of understanding and existence. The undead who worship him as the Prince of Death see in his corruption not a source of horror but a pathway to a different kind of life. The Age of Duskborn that his existence makes possible would restore death to its proper place in the cosmic order not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a natural and necessary counterpart to life itself. Perhaps this is Godwyn's final lesson. That transformation, however painful and incomprehensible, remains always possible. The Golden Prince may be gone forever, but the Prince of Death offers something that the old order never could: the promise that endings are not always failures, that corruption can become the soil for new growth, and that even the deepest darkness can give birth to forms of light previously unimaginable. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind settle on the image of that throne room in the deep-root depths. Purple waters lap against ancient stone. Flies buzz through air thick with the essence of undeath. A fish-tailed monstrosity rests in the shadow of tainted roots. This is where Godwyn the Golden continues his transformed existence. He is no longer the prince who befriended dragons or commanded golden lightning. Those days are gone, lost to the night of black knives and the cruel mathematics of fractured death. But he remains what he always was at heart, a bridge between different worlds, a figure who makes possible connections that should not exist, a reminder that the boundaries we imagine to be absolute are often far more fluid than we dare to believe. Think of Fortissax, the ancient dragon who loved his friend so deeply that he followed him into corruption and death. Think of Miquella, praying desperately for his brother to find true death and release from suffering. Think of Fear, who embraced horror to transform it into hope. Think of all those who loved Godwyn and who continue to be shaped by his absence. Their stories remind us that even in a world as dark and broken as the lands between, love and devotion persist. Friendship can transcend the boundaries between species and epochs. Family bonds can survive curses and catastrophes, and even the most complete tragedy can give birth to unexpected forms of meaning. The mist that shrouds the deepest places of the lands between carries with it the memory of what was lost and the promise of what might yet be found. In those depths where ancient sorrows echo through crumbling stone, and the weight of transformation presses down like winter fog, Godwyn the Golden continues his eternal watch, no longer a prince of light, but a lord of shadows who offers his own form of salvation to those brave enough to seek it in the darkness. Perhaps in the end, that is enough. Perhaps it is enough that Godwyn's sacrifice, willing or unwilling, opened pathways to new forms of existence, new relationships between life and death, new possibilities for those who had been excluded from the old order's vision of perfection. The Golden Prince may be dead, but the Prince of Death lives on. And in his corrupted existence, hope takes root in the most unlikely soil. As you fall asleep tonight, remember Godwyn the Golden. Remember the prince who should have saved the world but became instead its greatest tragedy. Remember how his death shattered an empire and gave birth to new forms of existence. Remember that even in the darkest stories, there are glimmers of light acts of loyalty, expressions of love, prayers for mercy that echo through the ages. The lands between are vast and full of mysteries, each story connected to countless others in ways we're only beginning to understand. Godwyn's tale touches nearly every major event of the Shattering, from Marika's destruction of the Elden Ring to the wars between demigods, from the emergence of those who live in death to the possibility of the Age of Duskborn. His legacy is written in the roots beneath our feet, in the death blight that erupts in forgotten catacombs, in the prayers of those who seek a true death for the prince who was denied it. It's written in the memory of ancient dragons and in the desperate researches of curious sorcerers. It's written in golden epitaphs and amber medallions in the very structure of the world that was shattered by his passing. And now, as you drift into dreams, let the story of Godwyn the Golden fade into the background of your consciousness. Let it become part of the landscape of your sleep, a tale of glory and tragedy, of friendship and betrayal, of death that refused to be complete, and life that persisted in the most twisted forms. Tomorrow, you'll wake to your own world with its own challenges and opportunities. But tonight, you've walked through the lands between. You've seen the heights of the Golden Age and the depths of corruption. You've witnessed loyalty that transcended death and love that survived even the destruction of the soul. Sleep well, traveler. Dream of golden lightning and ancient dragons, of princes who befriended their enemies and death that came on black-bladed knives. Dream of a world that might have been, where Godwyn lived to lead with wisdom and mercy, where the Golden Order evolved rather than shattered, where hope proved stronger than ambition. And when you wake, carry with you the lessons of Godwyn's tale, that mercy can be strength, that bridges built between enemies can prove stronger than walls, that some curses transform into unexpected blessings, and that even in tragedy, meaning can be found if we're brave enough to seek it. The Prince of Death waits in his throne room beneath the world, neither alive nor dead, neither damned nor saved. He waits as he has waited since the night of black knives, as he will wait until the world's ending or renewal. And in his waiting, he serves as testament to the truth that some stories never truly end. They simply transform, becoming part of the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that governs all existence. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the golden radiance of what was, the dark corruption of what is, and the uncertain promise of what might yet be. May you rest well in the knowledge that even the most broken things can serve a purpose, and that in the lands between, as in our own world, tragedy and hope are forever intertwined. The story of Godwyn the Golden, the Prince of Gold, who became the Prince of Death, comes to rest here, not with an ending, for his tale has no true ending, but with an acknowledgement that we've traced his journey as far as mortal understanding can follow. What lies beyond in the depths of his death-touched consciousness, in the future ages that might or might not come to pass, remains shrouded in the mists of mystery. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some stories should remain partially untold, some mysteries partially unsolved, some tragedies honored but not fully comprehended. Godwyn's fall was so complete, his transformation so profound, that to claim full understanding would be presumptuous. We can only bear witness, remember what was lost, and wonder at what strange new forms of existence were born from his incomplete death. So sleep now, carrying with you the memory of golden hair like spun sunlight, of lightning that crackled with draconic power, of a prince who represented the best of what the Golden Order might have been. Sleep knowing that his story, however tragic, was not meaningless, that from his suffering came new possibilities, from his death came new forms of life, and from his corruption came the seeds of potential renewal. The lands between await another dawn, another age, another chapter in their endless cycle of glory and decay. And somewhere in the depths beneath the Erd tree, the Prince of Death continues his vigil, a monument to what was lost, and a promise of what might yet be reborn from the ashes of the old world. Rest well, traveler. The story is told, the night grows deep, and sleep beckons. May you find in dreams what Godwyn lost in life, peace, completion, and the gentle embrace of merciful darkness that promises dawn will eventually return.